Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to get started in just one more minute. Going to give people just another minute to get logged in. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot to cover. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Cami Dodson. I'm the HIV Reproductive Justice Fellow at Positive Women's Network. This is our Criminalization as Violence Against People Living with HIV webinar. I think it's a fitting thing to talk about as we prepare for World AIDS Day and reflect on National Day of Action to End Violence Against Women Living with HIV. I'm going to start by discussing our webinar objectives. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different things today, but the main things that we want to make sure we cover are that you come out of this understanding how policing and incarceration disproportionately affect the communities who are impacted by HIV, talk about the specific challenges of incarceration and reentering back into the community for people living with HIV, especially women. We want to talk about HIV criminalization as a specific form of violence against people living with HIV. We want to introduce you to our new fact sheet. I know it's been around, we've sent it out on a lot of lists and everything, but we want to make sure that we really go into it in a little bit more detail since it does have a lot of dense information. And we want to also highlight some policy recommendations we have and actions that you all can take to help challenge the different forms of violence against people living with HIV that we're going to be talking about. And if someone could just type that you can hear me, just to make sure before we get in too deep that all our technology is working, that would be great. All right, thanks so much, everyone. So yeah, we have the chat box here, so you can ask questions as we go, but we'll also have time for question and answer at the end. So you can also just keep track of your questions as you go, and we'll get to them at the end. So here's our agenda. We're doing our welcome now. Then we're going to move to Arnita, who's going to talk about this concept of criminalization as violence against people living with HIV. And what prompted us to make this fact sheet and bring these different perspectives together on the webinar today. Then we're going to move to Megan McLemore from Human Rights Watch, who is going to talk more specifically about policing and law enforcement and how that impacts transgender women in particular. We're going to hear from Teresa Sullivan, who's one of our PWN board members and a member of PWN-USA and Philadelphia Fight. She's going to talk more specifically about incarceration and reentry into the community for women living with HIV. And then we're going to move to Robert Settle from the Thero Project to talk about HIV criminalization specifically. And then I will bring us back together to actually introduce the fact sheet and talk about how these things connect together as well as policy recommendations. And then hopefully we'll hear from you all with your questions. So here are our wonderful presenters. We have Megan from Human Rights Watch, who's actually done research and reported on a lot of this information that we drew from the fact sheet. We have Robert Settle from the Thero Project. We have Teresa Sullivan, one of our board members and a member of PWN Philly. We have me, and then we have Arnita, our policy and advocacy manager at Positive Women's Network USA. And so one last thing before I turn it over to Arnita to give us a little bit more framing is I just want to acknowledge that we're going to be getting into a lot of in-depth, heavy information. I know that many of you on the call are really passionate about this work and, you know a lot from personal experience and just from your role as an activist about these issues. But I know that, you know, it might be difficult at times as we go through this. So just, you know, if you need to take a breather, you know, do that. Or if you need to like check in on the chat box, that's okay too. I just want to acknowledge that some of this is difficult, and I think it's important to give yourself space to process and take a break if you need to. This will be recorded and on our website, so it'll be available. I see someone asked about closed captioning. I'm sorry, we don't have that. We will have it as a recording. I can get back to you about options for transcribing, but as far as I know, we aren't going to be able to do any closed captioning at this time. I'm sorry, since we're going live. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Arnita.
Okay, great.
Give us more of the overview.
Thank you, Cami. Thank you for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so as Cami was saying, that this webinar spun out of a continuation of the conversation that we started this year on our Day of Action to End Violence Against Women Living with HIV. So for the past 3 years, Positive Women's Network has organized a Day of Action to raise awareness about and advocate to end the interpersonal, community, and institutional violence that is experienced by women living with HIV at alarming rates. This is one of our main policy priorities, something that we organize our community widely around. This year, we produced a fact sheet that was aimed at shining specific light and significant light upon criminalization as its own form of violence and the different forms of harms that result from criminalization as its own form of violence that should be addressed at this time more intentionally in our advocacy efforts. So it's widely documented that there is a link between high rates of violence and trauma and women living with HIV. Women living with HIV experience intimate partner violence at rates that are higher than in population of women in general in the United States, and also emotional and physical abuse. These forms of violence, they lead to poor mental and physical health outcomes that manifest in diagnoses of higher rates of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, which ultimately can lead to barriers to remaining and staying in care and fulfilling, sustaining a healthy life. And so when we begin talking about criminalization, criminalization impacts some members of our community more so than others. So we know that there's a disparate impact on women of color and low-income women on criminalization. These are also people that are groups of our community that are also more likely to be living with HIV in the United States. And so some communities face discriminatory policing and levels of surveillance by law enforcement that, upon also being women of color or low income, can also be further compounded by discriminatory policing and surveillance that's based on sexual identity or perceived sexual identity or gender identity or perceived or actual immigration status, which we'll talk about. And so these increasing rates of incarceration and the constant threat of incarceration or surveillance serve as a form of trauma on its own, and we can look at them and examine them as a source of violence. And then we also, in our fact sheet, we go into the ways that criminalization also spurs interpersonal violence. So HIV criminalization laws, which we'll discuss later, Robert will talk about, non-disclosure and exposure laws. These open up people to increased potential threats for abuse or coercion in relationships where someone might be afraid to go to the police if they are in an intimate partner violence situation for fear that they might be criminalized under HIV criminalization statute. And then again, with policing practices like criminalizing sex work makes it unsafe for sex workers and limits their ability to protect themselves from violence at the hands of law enforcement or others, and also makes them vulnerable to harassment and abuse. And other ways of criminalizing sex work, not just actual sex work, but policies like condoms as evidence laws also perpetuate this model and undermine the safety of members of our community. So today, this conversation, it comes at a really critical point right now as we look forward to how we will challenge this, what many in our community will perceive as a very hostile political environment. And so it's important to walk away from this conversation thinking about how we can stand in solidarity with members of our communities that will be most vulnerable to forms of criminalization and surveillance in the years to come. And so hopefully this conversation can better equip us to be good advocates. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. This is Megan Maxwell-Moore from Human Rights Watch. I just wanted to share some work that I've been doing looking at the connection between HIV risk among trans women and the criminal justice system. There's a lot of talk about, how high the HIV rates are among trans women, particularly women of color. But especially at the federal and state government levels, there is little to no acknowledgement of how heavy policing, arrest, and detention are contributing to the HIV risk among trans women. So I've pulled together some data that helps to illustrate this issue from several different perspectives. So we're just going to walk through some slides, and then I'll look forward to really the discussion at the end of the webinar, because I'd love to get your ideas on how to further this work and how to how to coordinate with you all. I just want to say that I'm really thrilled that PWN is doing such an amazing job spotlighting this issue, and just really looking forward to collaborating with PWN on some advocacy on these issues. So just an overview about HIV. The HIV prevalence among transgender women in the United States is nearly 30%. Just to get a perspective, the prevalence among the general population in the United States is less than 1%. And it's even higher among transgender women of color. The most recent systematic review of the scientific studies showed that on average 56% of transgender women of color were HIV positive from those studies, versus 17% of white transgender women and 16% of Latina transgender women. So these numbers are truly alarming and completely unacceptable from a public health and human rights point of view. The factors that are contributing to this are, poverty, homelessness, incarceration, and violence. Each of these factors in and of themselves has been demonstrated to be associated with higher HIV risk. For example, poverty, is probably the number one driver of HIV infection in the U.S., and is exacerbated by homelessness and housing instability. and incarceration and violence, which is what we're going to focus on today. Both of those factors, both incarceration and violence, have been shown to increase poverty and increase housing instability. So I think in many ways, the community of trans women, particularly of color, are caught in a crisis of these structural factors that are driving really high HIV rates. So let's just look at incarceration real quick. I mean, as I said, it's associated now in many scientific studies with increased HIV risk. Even a brief incarceration is associated with increased HIV risk and poor HIV outcomes. And this is even more pronounced for women and for people of color. And 1 in 5 transgender women report a history of incarceration, and this increases to 1 of 2 for African American transgender women, who report higher rates of incarceration and sexual assault in detention than white, non-Hispanic transgender women. So, you know, it's becoming quite well documented, this disproportionate rate of incarceration. Just in terms of violence, transgender people in general report high rates of violence in all venues, home, public, and in detention. In 2013, the majority of victims of hate crime homicides in the United States were transgender women, with 60% being women of color. There were 21 transgender women reported murdered in 2015, and 13 reported murdered in the first 6 months of 2016. So that number is now even higher, and the majority were women of color. In terms of violence and law enforcement, transgender people, both men and women, are 7 times more likely to experience police violence than cisgender people. Transgender people of color are 6 times more likely to experience police violence than white transgender people. And Human Rights Watch has documented police abuse and sexual exploitation of transgender women in many cities throughout the U.S. In terms of detention itself, the data reported from the Prison Rape Elimination Act showed that between 2007 and 2012, more than a third of adult transgender prisoners reported sexual assault in U.S. prisons and jails, with higher rates than that among transgender women of color. In California, for example, 60% of female transgender prisoners are housed in men's prisons, and they reported sexual assault. And the federal law, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, does require case-by-case housing determination based on safety rather than biological gender, but many state and local jails and prisons continue to assign without regard to safety. I mean, many really should be most. This is a policy issue that really needs to be highlighted, because federal guidelines and even federal law in this case is not being enforced. Also, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency policy for immigration detention is very vague on housing assignment for transgender detainees. It's in no way being enforced. In 2016, we released a report documenting violence against transgender women in U.S. immigration detention, and found that half of our interviewees had spent time in a male facility. Many reported sexual abuse from other inmates and guards, and those reporting abuse frequently were put in solitary confinement to, quote, ensure their safety. But, you know, that's not an acceptable response either. In terms of violence and HIV risk, as Arnita mentioned, at the federal level, there is an interagency task force on gender-based violence, HIV, and HIV, and they've come up with some data that shows pretty clearly a link between interpersonal violence and HIV. One of two women living with HIV have experienced intimate partner violence. That's 55% versus 36% for women overall, which both numbers are horrifying. And among women living with HIV, a history of IPV is linked to reduced access to antiretroviral medications and care, and reduced adherence to those medications, as well as increased rates of death from HIV. HIV status is frequently reported as a cause of intimate partner violence, and 58% of transgender women report a history of IPV. So again, we're looking at sort of disproportionate rates of all of these problems and issues related to violence. In terms of law enforcement and HIV risk, also, as has been mentioned, Human Rights Watch and others, including the Open Society Foundation and the PROS Network in New York, have documented the police use of condoms as evidence of prostitution. This is a practice that has been shown to reduce the willingness of sex workers and those who are suspected of sex work and likely to be stopped to carry the condoms that they need to protect themselves. It disproportionately impacts transgender women, particularly women of color, who are often profiled as sex workers by the police. There are in many cities now, because of great activism work, there are guidelines for police to follow to relate to the LGBT community, and these often include prohibition on profiling LGBT people, and particularly transgender women, as sex workers. But again, these must be enforced in order to be effective, and that's often very sketchy, as we all know. So, I think that we all need to focus on detention as a site of violence against transgender women and a site of HIV risk. Jail is where I assume I caught HIV, said my friend and colleague Tila Love from New Orleans. She said trans girls were just prey for career criminals in there with no protection. Data are scarce on HIV transmission in jails and prisons generally, and we do know that most incarcerated persons with HIV had the virus before entering prison. However, prevention measures, However, prevention measures in jails and prisons are virtually non-existent, as we all know. People describe using plastic bags and rubber gloves for protection when they're able. So that is another policy issue that needs to be urgently addressed. Now let's talk a little bit about policy. The U.S. National HIV/AIDS Strategy, the new one for 2020, does address gender-based violence as increasing HIV risk for women and girls. It also includes transgender women in a call for more research and programming on violence and HIV risk. Those are definitely positive steps. However, it fails to address the criminal justice system even remotely as a site for violence against transgender women, or for really fueling the HIV epidemic in the U.S. in general. And it definitely fails to address the HIV risk to transgender women and others from from the criminal justice system, from all aspects of the criminal justice system. So our recommendations that are developing, and open to, inclusion of many others. But right now, the highlights would be that the U.S. HIV and public health officials must acknowledge the links between HIV risk and the criminal justice system in the United States. There has to be more research on HIV risk from sexual assault in jails and prisons. And U.S. law must require and enforce housing assignment based on safety for all transgender detainees, including immigration detention. And the U.S. must address the root causes of high incarceration and violence against transgender people, which include poverty, homelessness, and discrimination. So that's it for me today, but I'm really looking forward to our discussion at the end of the webinar. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Megan. That's really eye-opening information, and yeah, I look forward to talking more with the audience about this at the end. And now to build off of that, we have Teresa, who's going to talk about incarceration and reentry for women living with HIV. Are you there, Teresa? Teresa, you might need to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, thank you. So I just want to give a little background about how I came to this work before I begin my slides. I came to this work about 8-9 years ago as a woman living with HIV who did some time behind the walls. And I came out and I seen how important it was for women to have reentry services provided to them and to address the barriers that we face. And we face a lot of barriers when we come home. There's a number of women currently incarcerated has grown to over 50% over the past 25 years. That's an alarming percentage of women that are disproportionately impacted by HIV and women of color. Another thing that's happening when women have to reenter back into the community, it becomes a financial hardship, not just on them trying to find employment, but it's also a financial hardship while they're currently incarcerated on their family and loved ones. They have to go up, take long visits to go visit their family member, and for a lot of times, women are moved to facilities that are very outside of the realm of their cities in another state. Very hard for their family members to even get transportation, to even visit their family members. There was a survey in 2014 done on half of all formerly incarcerated people and their family members experiencing negative health outcomes and loss of income related to those loved ones being incarcerated, because what we know is that the woman that was taken away from the family, she was the sole person that was taking care of the family and the children. Once you remove that person from the home, that home becomes more impacted by poverty at an alarming rate, especially for children. The impact on loved ones. What we found out that depression and anxiety, including post-traumatic stress disorder, impacts people who are incarcerated, but it also impacts their loved ones and their children. It impacts the children to the point where when they do poorly in school, they miss a lot of time in school because they're depressed. They miss a lot of time because of shame. If they have to talk about their parent or mother being incarcerated, a lot of times children tend to withdraw from other kids while going to school. They isolate themselves, and a lot of times the children tend to blame themselves, and they go through a system of thinking that they have caused the parent to be incarcerated, causing them to have low self-esteem. And a lot of times we have a lot of kids dropping out of school behind that. That is a violation against women and their children on an economic level and a social educational level, when we're impacting and locking women up just because they're HIV positive, and by getting them other alternatives to incarceration, to stay home with their families and take care of their families. So I also put on here that 79% of those coming home are ineligible for housing programs because their conviction history leaves them without a home plan or stable housing. There is a federal law and a state law in Pennsylvania, and I can't speak for all states, but I can speak for my own, that if a woman has a history of incarceration and she has a felony, she's no longer eligible for public housing. And she cannot live with anyone that has public housing. And a lot of the family members, because if you go back to what I said, a lot of these families are living below the poverty level. They're living in traditional housing programs for low-income housing for their families. They can't come back and ask their families to give them a stable place to live because they have a felony. Right, so now the woman has nowhere to live. That becomes another barrier for her finding employment. That becomes another barrier for her to be taking her medication in the first place to live a long and productive life. Another issue that we found is that when women are coming home, regaining custody often becomes a barrier for women. If a woman has no family members that's willing to step up to the plate and take on her children while she's incarcerated, they tend to lose custody of their children. The children wind up in foster care, which is another barrier for the women once they get home, trying to communicate with their families and their children. They have to go through several steps of first finding employment, and which is a hard thing once you come home because now you have a record. You can't find employment, or most likely people will not employ you because you have a felony. They do background checks, even though here in Pennsylvania we have a new law called Ban the Box, which is a good thing, but they still have a right during the interview to ask you about your criminal record, and that can opt you out from getting the employment after the initial interview. I put on here, which is my favorite, and I'm hoping that you would copy this link from Sesame Street. There's this Muppet named Alex. They did this wonderful show about the impact on children when the parents go to jail and why children fall into a depression, anxiety state when their parents are incarcerated. What does that look like for children, and how does that impact their lives as they go through life trying to mature and grow in a society that has a lot of stigma on people, period, that has a history of incarceration. It don't just impact the person, it impacts the whole family at home altogether. Barriers to reentry. Families that are living, like I said, below the poverty level, housing are not allowed to have loved ones move back in with them. So therefore, they're left without a home plan. If they are doing state time, especially state time, and sometimes and the state road here in Pennsylvania, if you don't have a home plan, right, that you cannot have approved by your probation officer or parole officer, then you wind up being behind the wall a little longer. You have to have a home plan. That home plan cannot include someone in your family that's living in low-income housing. And it goes back to what I said, the revolving door, the majority of these families that are being impacted and disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration are people that are people of color, women of color, and families that live below the poverty level. employment is difficult, almost impossible for citizens returning to the community. It's impossible for women to come back and just try to start the process of just getting the photo ID, or even having transportation is also a barrier for them getting around to get to an initial interview for a job because they have no source of income. For a lot of people in our state in Pennsylvania, that if you have a history of incarceration, it's almost virtually impossible for you to get public assistance. That opts you out because you have a history of incarceration, which is also a violence against women. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about our recommendations from PWN. We want to repeal and reform HIV exposure, non-disclosure, and transmission laws in every state and territory that has them, especially here in Pennsylvania. We want to end the laws of enforcement practice that target communities disproportionately impacted by HIV, including people with trans experience, sex workers, people who use drugs, immigrants, mental illness, and communities of color. Congress should repeal the federal lifetime ban on temporary aid to needy families, which is also known as the TAF, and the SNAP food stamp assistance program for people with felonies. And it goes back to saying that if a person has a history of incarceration, they are opt out for resources that will enhance the ability to take care of themselves, take care of their children, right, and get back into enter into the community in a positive manner. Because that's why we continue to have a revolving recidivism door, is because we do not have programs that help people re-entering back into our communities. So thank you very much. So
thank you so much, Teresa.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, so there's my information there. Yep.
Great, and we'll leave time for the audience to ask you more questions at the end too. Thank you so much.
Yes.
I just want to point out that I thought it was really important to bring in the perspective that Teresa is talking about, which is the impact of incarceration and its aftermath, because I just wanted to sort of open up the idea that violence comes in many forms. It doesn't have to just necessarily look like, hitting or physically hurting someone, but violence, violence can be someone not having a place to live because there are legal barriers, or not being able to feed themselves because of these legal barriers. Or, violence can be in the form of separating children from their parents because of these institutional barriers that people face. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well, and this is something we can think about more at the end. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Robert, who's going to talk about HIV criminalization, which I think is a very important form of institutional violence against people living with HIV that we all could definitely learn more about and hope to challenge. So go ahead, Robert.
Thank you, Cami, and hello to everyone that I have not spoken to. It's a pleasure to be here with you all sharing, and I have to say that every time I'm always on a webinar, whether it's with PWN or some other organization or through CIRO, HIV is Not a Crime, I'm always learning something new and just being empowered with information. And I can just say that just from listening to Teresa and Monica's presentation, I can just reflecting on my own personal experience of experiencing some of the direct consequences of being incarcerated and having to face conviction and having to continue to live after that experience and to move forward and experience some of the barriers that exist that were just shared. So thank you, ladies, for that. And I'm here to talk about HIV criminalization, and I think most of us are pretty familiar with the issue. And I'm just glad to have this opportunity just to share. And probably what I'm sharing is probably information you already are aware of. I never take it too lightly that there are people who are in the room that already know about this issue. There's always one or two or so many people that don't know, but it's nice to have a refresher, and there's always something new that we can pull from it. So HIV criminalization, form of state-sponsored discrimination that creates a viral underclass in the law, which singles out people living with HIV for criminal penalties for non-disclosure, perceived exposure, and transmission of HIV. I have to say that I didn't know anything about these laws at the time when I was diagnosed. I just didn't know anything about it. And so to live to find out that there are 30 plus states and as well as some territories that have HIV specific statutes, and that I actually lived in one in Louisiana. And then I moved to one which was Florida. I moved to another one, which was Florida, to deal with my HIV diagnosis. I graduated from college and was go away to find a job because I couldn't get into the military, which is how I learned about my HIV diagnosis. And I moved to a state that I had no idea that the laws were just as worse. So coming from Louisiana to Florida. So I have to say, and I just did not know. And so doing this work and perhaps going through this experience has really opened my eyes and my mind to so much around HIV criminalization, around incarceration, and other things. And so I think that this is something that's very important and a very timely issue to discuss. And so there are HIV-specific statutes that exist in 30 plus states. The jurisdictions without HIV-specific statutes also prosecute people living with HIV using enhanced penalties and general laws. So, for example, if you're found to commit some crimes and you just happen to be HIV positive, that there could be stiffer penalties for you simply based on your HIV status, and likely depending on whatever the crime or the offense is. So I like to say, which has already been highlighted in the previous presentations, to speak about the social environment, meaning who are we talking about when we're talking about incarceration, HIV criminalization, or any form of criminalization or incarceration. So people living with and affected by HIV frequently come from socially and politically vulnerable communities: poor people, racial minorities, transgender people, young people, immigrants. And I think it's important that when we do share our talks about this issue, that we do remind the rest of America of who are we talking about, because we're not talking about violent people or Black people or people of color who are violent. We're talking about a range of people who come from various backgrounds and experiences, community members who face multiple intersections of stigma and discrimination, distraught history with public health and the police, even before HIV. And so some people are already having hard times in life, and of course having an HIV diagnosis and navigating through that, and having to find that you can be prosecuted and threatened with that, it just makes it even more difficult to interact with agencies and services just to live. And we're also talking about communities who are already disproportionately criminalized. So why are these laws so bad? Well, another way to incarcerate already marginalized and vulnerable communities. And what is so sad that I find that is saddening is that even within our own communities, that I feel like there's a lot of infighting around issues like this, issues that are so complex, issues that where there can be a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding. And so when you go before law enforcement or you go before a court or these structural institutions that don't really serve us, I feel like it creates a lot of infighting within our communities. And so we find ourselves blaming and perpetuating this cycle of incarceration when realizing that this issue, specifically around HIV criminalization, is our issue, and it's a phenomenon that is impacting our communities, our people, and yet we have laws and on the books that work against us. And so I think in some way we hurt ourselves in some instances as well as the structural institutions committing violence against us as well. Why are these laws so bad? It's one of the drivers of today's epidemic. I mean, if most people don't know, find out about the laws and they know that, well, I can be arrested for, disclosing or disclose, or someone finding out about my HIV status, that then I won't tell. I will be silent. And I had to think about that for myself. I'm like, would I have done that? But I don't know. At this point, I don't know if I did, but I had to think about it for myself. Like, wow, would I have not shared if I knew about these laws? And so that's why I feel that most people, when they are caught up in a situation where they're about their HIV, that they do want to be honest, or in some instances where they're not honest, there's a reason perhaps why they're not honest, or there's some instances where people do share too much information. You do share, yes, I'm HIV positive, yes, I'm taking meds, but it depends on who you're talking to, because those things can be used against you. But I feel like when people have that fear, that it can prevent them from wanting to get tested and even staying in care. But unfortunately, I think most people don't know how far are the real legal implications of what it means when you're faced with an accusation or threatened with prosecution. And mostly, this just has a dehumanizing effect. You have a felony conviction, you're having to register as a sex offender in some states, not all states, but some states. Lengthy prison sentences. We are aware that in some states you can be sentenced up to 25 years or 30 or 60. In my state, Louisiana, it was up to 10 years. And also, if you're a parent, you lost of parental rights for your children, which Teresa has really highlighted that very well. There was a point that I was going to make. I forgot it. But moving on, why are these laws so bad? The laws are not based in science or require criminal intent. And when we talk about violence, as Cami just said, it doesn't have to be about someone assaulting you physically. But the fact that we live in a country where we don't acknowledge the science, or you can be prosecuted for and not even have actual criminal intent. That's kind of crazy to me, especially if you're a person that is on treatment and in care. I mean, why doesn't the government, or why doesn't these agencies acknowledge that? And that's the problem today, that these structural institutions are not acknowledging the science. They're not acknowledging the real facts. And so people are facing incarceration and having their lives changed as a result of governments and agencies that won't even say words that need to be said, or implement policies that need to be implemented because of how they feel about HIV or about poor people or whatever. And I just think that's not right. And that's even more reason for us to continue to fight to address this issue, to state the facts, to know, the science and to know what we're talking about when we go against people sharing our discussion and our message around HIV and HIV criminalization and incarceration and so on and so forth. We can't let them win because science is on our side. And I just think that it's a great injustice that we don't acknowledge the science or acknowledge the real risk and routes of transmission of HIV. And overall, these laws do more harm than good when it comes to supporting public health approaches. And again, public health being another one of those entities that I'm glad that we have some allies out there that have passed resolutions condemning HIV criminalization, and more have come on board from the medical side. And so we just have to continue to push forth this message. And so far, change has happened, and I believe that change will continue to happen as we continue to get information and do what we need to do to address this issue. I wanted to highlight some other effects of criminalization, which have already been highlighted previously. The criminalization of sex workers or people who are charged with prostitution, soliciting for prostitution while living with HIV. I've learned so much more just presently about how how we talking about HIV criminalization from a consensual sexual perspective, but how the criminalization of sex workers makes them vulnerable to HIV infection for especially when dealing with law enforcement. And so it creates repressive law enforcement practices, which takes away from addressing real issues around assault or other violent offenses. And another issue I wanted to highlight or to acknowledge was sexual assault, particularly from what I've learned just over the few short years, and because I'm not involved in advocacy around sexual assault, but I do respect the perspective, and that in some situations where there are power dynamics between a man and a woman, and in some cases there women are contract HIV from their partner, from their male partner, who could be very abusive in some situations. And so sometimes if there's this situation where the woman contracted HIV from her violent partner, that in court of law, that's pretty much is the only way that he can, that justice can be brought to that situation. And I totally understand, and I think that these are a few of the exceptions, but also these laws shouldn't be used to suppress women living with HIV, because if you are in fact a woman living with HIV, you could find yourself, on both sides of the aisle in the courtroom, from being considered a perpetrator and also to be a victim in certain situations. So I just wanted to highlight that to show that we're not just totally, although we would love to see these laws changed and repealed or modernized or whatever the term is, but I think it needs to be done in a fair and honest and accurate manner, and not simply based off biases. So that's why it's important that we state the facts and present them in court, and hopefully can bring about change to where these things can be sort of monitors or measures taken seriously when it comes to the issue of HIV involvement. Next slide. So what can we continue to do about talking about HIV criminalization? I think we need to talk about it more and continue to talk about it. It's the only way that we're going to be able to reach the masses, is each of one of us talk to somebody that doesn't know about this issue, especially people who have influence in the community or anywhere. We need to talk about it more. People need accurate information about their legal vulnerabilities. And also people need to learn possible strategies to protect themselves from prosecution in the event that they are threatened with prosecution. Get involved with statewide campaigns or grassroots organizing around criminalization reform efforts. There are several that are going on around the country in certain states as we speak. And if you're interested in getting involved, just please get with someone with PWN or myself at Zero, and we'll be happy to let you know which states are doing what work. Join HIV is Not a Crime webinar. Since our second conference this year, there have been a series of webinars that have happened. And these webinars provide practical training on strategies and best practices for changing laws that criminalize people with HIV. And I know a lot of people come and they're ready to learn more about the issue and ready to get involved. And we have to continue to get get training and stay engaged so that we can learn about new developments and strategies and ways to talk about this issue, as well as to develop strategy in our states. I think the most difficult part is learning how to get started. And I feel like education is where it's at. You may not always have the opportunity to do the big stuff like talking to legislators, but you can talk to each other. You can talk to community people, family, friends. That's where it starts, because we need those people to understand what we're talking about. And so we have to constantly educate them on the issue. And that means educating ourselves as well. And lastly, attend community forums or workshops at annual conferences. Again, a part of just educating yourself, or an extension of educating yourself, is attending any conferences or webinars such as this that touch on issues around HIV criminalization and other issues as well. And I think that's my last slide. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank all of the presenters for sharing all that information and your personal stories. It's really powerful. And it just really reminds me how much work there is to do, but it also is really inspiring to hear about all these different opportunities that we can work together and continue this work. So thank you again, everyone. With that, I just wanted to bring this back together to the fact sheet and talk about why we had these perspectives on and how it relates to the resources that we're hoping you all will be able to use in your own advocacy and for education within your communities, or to policymakers, anyone who you can find to talk about these issues with. This brings me to our Criminalization as Violence Against Women Living with HIV fact sheet. There's the link to the website, the Positive Women's Network website. We have a PDF version you can access. You can pull it up right now if you want to. And we have it just on our website in a normal page as well. So I just wanted to bring it back to what Arnita talked about in the beginning, and how all these things that the presenters really wonderfully explained connect to violence. As Arnita mentioned, we know that people living with HIV face unacceptably high levels of violence, especially women. We know that this has really devastating impacts on people's ability to adhere to treatment and, live the healthy lives that they deserve to have. And so we have to call out and respond to all forms of violence, whether it happens between partners, whether it happens on the street, or whether it happens at the hands of people in power who are supposed to be protecting us and providing for the greater good. So that's really what this fact sheet is about. It basically reviews the different topics that Megan, Robert, and Teresa brought up all in one place to really focus the analysis on these institutional forms of violence against women, in particular, living with HIV. So just to go a little bit more in depth, the fact sheet's really dense. It's like a very heavy 4 pages, so I just wanted to break it down a little. Basically, it covers the things that our presenters talked about: HIV criminalization, discriminatory law enforcement practices, so for example, targeting of sex workers or people they perceive to be as sex workers, targeting of trans and gender non-conforming people, homeless people, things like that. It talks about police violence, harassment, and brutality, and in particular how those affect communities that are already disproportionately under surveillance, as Robert mentioned, and the other presenters mentioned as well. And then incarceration and reentry, and how the negative impacts on women with HIV and their families. So basically, it talks about these 4 different issues. Of course, there's tons of other things that we could talk about and that I'm sure you all have thought of over the course of this webinar, but we tried to cram it in 4 pages. So it covers those 4 issues, and basically it just provides some key facts about each issue. For example, like Robert mentioned, that there have been these prosecutions under HIV criminalization laws in at least 39 states, and that some of these laws carry sentences of 30 years or more, and some of the other facts that the presenters brought up. So basically, for each of these 4 issues, it has key facts, has a description of how this is a form of violence, and then it also provides policy recommendations for each of the 4 areas, as well as further reading, which I think is great because we have links to some resources like a Human Rights Watch report about how condoms as evidence puts people at risk, which Megan mentioned. So that's basically the overview of the fact sheet. I know you all have the presenters I thought already did a great job of laying out these issues, so I didn't want to go too much in depth of the actual facts on the fact sheet because I think they highlighted those. But I did just want to focus on the policy recommendations that we have in the fact sheet so that you can, point to those or build on them if you're using the fact sheet in the proactive way. So for HIV criminalization, and the way to address that, we recommend repealing or reforming all HIV exposure, non-disclosure, and transmission laws, and states still have them, passing the Repeal HIV Discrimination Act, which requires the Attorney General, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the Secretary of Defense to work with states and stakeholders to actually review the federal and state HIV criminal laws and provide guidance, as well as support and incentives for states to change their laws. If people are being prosecuted, we think that they should have competent and adequate legal support so that their human rights are protected. And like Robert was saying, there's so much misinformation about HIV transmission and risk, and so legislators, judges, prosecutors, even criminal defense attorneys, anyone who's involved in these laws needs to, they need to be educated on the actual science. The fact sheet also talks about law enforcement practices, which, and I think really is reinforced by all the information Megan was giving us. And our basic policy recommendations there are to end police targeting of queer people, trans people, sex workers, people who are perceived to be sex workers. There are some facts on the fact sheet about how people living with HIV fit into some of these communities. So, for example, about half of all people living with HIV will face homelessness or housing instability in their lives. So when police are criminalizing people for behaviors like, sleeping on the street or being in public because they don't have anywhere to live, that sort of thing puts people living with HIV at greater risk of criminalization. And so we also talk about reforming mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines and expanding community-based alternatives to incarceration, investing in syringe exchange programs, other harm reduction models for folks who may inject drugs or people with trans experience who may inject hormones. We need to eliminate condoms as evidence laws, other laws that criminalize sex workers or people who are perceived to be sex workers. And we need to disentangle immigration enforcement and law enforcement at all levels so that anyone, regardless of their immigration status, can report violence, access the services they need, access health care without fear of being deported or arrested. And the fact sheet does have a couple facts about immigration as well, since this is another community that's disproportionately impacted by policing. So being arrested for something like an HIV criminal law could trigger deportation for some people. Megan touched on this as well, the issue of police violence and brutality. We think that obviously law enforcement practices need to change so that law enforcement is not subjecting people living with HIV or people in communities impacted by HIV to discriminatory surveillance. There should be HIV sensitivity and anti-stigma trainings for law enforcement as well as other people that interact with people living with HIV, so child protective services and health department workers. I see someone commenting about restorative justice. Yeah, I think that's a really important idea and topic for thinking about what are our alternatives to incarceration and policing? How do we address harm in our communities? So that's definitely something, restorative justice folks, if you're involved in it, we'd love to hear about that as well. And then finally, incarceration and reentry. As Teresa talked about, we need to remove barriers to reintegrating in the community, such as bans on housing and food assistance. We need to pass banned box legislation in every state, and as Teresa mentioned, I think it could go further in terms of protecting people with criminal records. Probation and parole and community agencies that are tasked with interfacing with people who are in reentry should help them get care and should help people of trans experience in particular get the identity documents that they need to access services. And of course, while people are in prison, there's a desperate need for access to health care, including HIV medication, other forms of reproductive and sexual health care, and like Megan mentioned, preventative, condoms, preventative measures, and of course, transition and gender affirming care for people of transgender experience. And as Megan mentioned also, making sure that folks who are trans are not being housed in environments that are hostile to them. So that was a lot of information. We have almost 20 minutes now, so I think we're going to turn it over to questions, either about the fact sheet or about any of the specific topics the presenters talked about. So we have the chat box going. I can take it off of, I can make it so that people can unmute themselves and talk. I would just ask that please mute yourself if you are not asking a question, because we have a lot of, we have a lot of folks on the phone and we don't want to get a bunch of background noise. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the line.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
So you can unmute yourself by pressing *6.
Hi, can people hear me? This is Megan.
We can hear you now, Megan.
Okay, I just wanted to answer a question that I saw on the chat box, which was why is there so much resistance in corrections to implementing a policy for transgender people, based on their safety and their gender identity? That's a good question. I mean, I think the basic foundation of the problem is ignorance. I think most correctional officials have absolutely no clue about what, transgender experience is. And so, that's just for starters. So, I think leadership in education is desperately needed from the federal government, the state government, people who are in charge of and supposedly providing oversight to corrections institutions. Secondly, I think it's inconvenient, for them to do anything on a case-by-case basis. I think it requires more staffing, more thought, more preparation. And so they just have sort of an institutional resistance to anything that requires more work. And finally, though, I really think it's just discriminatory. I just don't think they value the safety of what they perceive to be, LGBT people. They just don't value the safety as highly. And, you can't ignore the fact that this is just a really pernicious human rights violation that seems to be continuing, despite some federal leadership on the issue. So, it's something that I'm going to be looking at closely in Florida for my next project. I'm going to be looking at HIV among trans women in Florida, and one of the main focuses of the report is going to be criminal justice system and the policy, this housing assignment policy. So we're going to be trying to hit it hard and highlight it, as much as we can. I fear under this new Department of Justice, though, that whatever federal leadership we've had on that issue is going to instantly disappear. But it just means we need to work harder.
Yeah, it's time to really get creative in our strategies. Thank you for that, Megan. Also, I wanted to
So
note,
this is
Mario
Teresa. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Yes. Yes, so someone asked me on the chat box. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yep, we can hear you, Teresa.
Okay. Okay, great. I never know. That we have on all states have reentry programs when people are coming home after incarceration. Unfortunately, no. Some states do, and are invested in restorative justice as an alternative to locking people up, which can be very costly. Because we have to talk about the elephant in the room, that prisons is a business, right? And people benefit from that, from the private sector to the public sector. We need to talk about restorative justice for people as an alternative instead of locking and taking people away from our communities and their families. So we still have a lot of work to be that we have to do when we need to talk in the same language and messaging for those who make those laws and incorporate restorative justice and letting them know that it's better to have people have more programs to keep them from going to jail than it costs you to lock them up for long periods of time. Right? And once we develop that language, which we have, right? But we have to implement it more in our, when we're talking to legislators who make these laws, people who are invested in prisons, and bring them over to our side about restorative justice and the benefit for our community. I just wanted to say that. Hello?
Thanks so much, Teresa. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have time for a few more questions. I just wanted to respond, or I wanted to point out that Mario asked about the intersection between criminalization or HIV criminalization and immigration, specifically in California. And in the chat box, Arnita put a link to a really good report that came out recently about that issue specifically. And I also wanted to comment that it might be different in every state, but one thing that's significant about HIV criminalization in general is that not everything that someone could get arrested or charged with is something that would trigger deportation. But the issue with HIV criminalization is because these laws are for example, in California, you can be deported for something that's a quote-unquote crime of moral turpitude, whatever that means, basically, things that for some reason they think are worse than other crimes. And so things that are connected to HIV criminalization can be those categorized as those type of offenses. So something that would maybe not be that serious for someone for their immigration status because of the type of crime it is under HIV criminalization, it could be something that becomes very serious and that it might trigger deportation or something like that. So it's a really important intersection that I think we need more information on.
And if I can add to that, just a thought that for other people who live in other countries that either may discriminate based on being LGBT, some people do seek exile to either Canada or US, or they have. And what's unfortunate that they may be also living with HIV, and then they come into countries like the US or even Canada who have laws, that are HIV specific or HIV related. And that person, if for some reason they're caught up in a situation of exposing someone to HIV or whatever the situation is, that if they are in fact found out to be HIV positive, that they could also, that they come into these countries like the US and Canada without any knowledge really about HIV criminalization laws and their impact. And so it's kind of unfortunate that you're leaving one country for because of one reason, then you come to a country and having to deal with another reason that or issue that that affects you, and without the knowledge that you need to understand how to navigate around these laws. And I think that's what's unfortunate too for people who come from other countries into our country, and they happen to be living with HIV, and they're not aware of these actual laws, and so they can definitely get caught up and be labeled as predators and monsters, and because they come from another country, just makes it, sensationalized as if they're just somebody who's just here to harm people.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I noticed folks were also asking on the chat box about how to look up the criminal laws in your state about HIV, and there's a few resources posted there I wanted to point out. I think Barb posted the Center for HIV Law and Policy. They have a website. They have something called the Positive Justice Project, and they've actually compiled laws for all the states that have them. So that link is up there as well. It's a really great resource. So we still have a few more minutes if anyone wants to press *6 to unmute themselves and ask another question. Thank you for all the great questions as well. Amen.
So this is Carrie Hartel. I just wanted to, I noticed that Tana posted in the chat box about condoms being used against sex workers, and I just wanted to point out that in many states where that exists, it's not always in the laws, and when it is in the laws, it doesn't even specify in many places that it's for sex work. So truthfully, somebody who is out doing outreach, let's say, and distributing condoms could actually also be prosecuted underneath that. It would be a pretty hard case to stick. And so it certainly is targeting sex workers, but the law is often not even as specific as to say sex workers.
Yes, this is Megan, and I want to second that in that basically in most states it's not ever written down anywhere as an actual law. It's really mostly a practice because no one ever really has, in many cases has even really thought about it. The police do it, the prosecutors, use them, and really nowhere, can you really find it, actually stated that it's permitted, or required in many cases. And now in California, it is written down because, we're not able to really prohibit the practice, but there was a law passed that makes it more difficult for prosecutors to actually use condoms as evidence. They have to show that it's, actually necessary to the case and stuff like that. How much effect that's going to have on policing on the ground is unclear. But yeah, I mean, in most cases, it's really sort of an unwritten practice. So that makes it harder to tackle in a lot of ways.
Thanks, Megan. I think that also, and Carrie, I think that also points to just some of the issues with, people being basically subject to arrest just for how they're perceived. So one of the things we talked about in the fact sheet is people living with HIV, particularly trans people and people of color, talking about how when they've tried to ask for police assistance, for example, when they've been the victim of physical assault or they're a survivor of domestic violence, they end up being the one who gets arrested. And so I think that just really highlights how not only are folks facing interpersonal violence, but the state is just re-victimized, and law enforcement is re-victimizing people because of the stigma or how they perceive them. So I think it's really important to keep in mind how these things are interconnected. I think
So this is Teresa. Can you hear
definitely
me?
chime in. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm glad that you said that, because that's actually my story, where I was in an interracial relationship. I was positive. I was out about my status and open about my status, and I was in an intimate partner violence relationship, where when the cops were called and I was the one that was abused, and because I was open about my status and what was going on when they arrived, I'm the one who got arrested, right, and did time behind the wall. Because one, because I'm a woman of color. Two, because I was open about my status, right, and three, because the police system believes, the police, when they arrive, they look at you because you must have did it because you have this HIV status, or they there's fear and stigma around a person living with HIV. Means I must be some kind of monster or do these kind of behaviors, inappropriate behaviors, which I did not do. But that was the mindset when they arrived at my doorstep. And I'm the one that was victimized, abused, and they believed him before they believed me, and they put the handcuffs on me. So it does happen in real life, because that is my story. When the last time I spent time behind the walls for about 4 months. Because it just goes to show that, yes, your nationality does play a part. Yes, your HIV status does play a part when it comes to policing people living with HIV, who they're more likely to believe, right? Especially when you're talking about intimate partner violence relationships, right? More than likely the woman, if she's positive and she's a woman of color, she's the one that's going to be arrested. And they would tell him that he needs, whoever the partner is that's doing the harm, that he just needs to show up for court. Those kind of things need to change when we're talking about violence against women and women of color, and especially when we're talking about intimate partner violence relationships.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Teresa. I think that right there just illustrates why these issues are something that we need to keep talking about, and I hope nothing like that ever happens to someone, but it is happening, and it's not just individuals, it's systemic. So thank you for that, Teresa. I think actually that was really powerful, and I would like to just leave it on that note. Unless anyone else has any burning questions, you can always email me or any of the presenters. There's their contact information. And I also put some of the different websites, so you could check out Thero Project. I know they have a lot of good resources and ways to be involved, and they're national, maybe even international. I know that their work is all over the place, so there's lots of ways to get involved. Human Rights Watch, of course, is tons of resources and data. You can, if you're not part of a regional chapter at PWN, you should definitely check one out. We have ones all over the country, and many of them are involved in work against to end violence against women living with HIV, as well as HIV criminalization. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. And there's there's some of our wonderful PWN members, and I just wanted to put the link to the fact sheet as well as other resources up there. So thank you everyone for joining us and for all of the audience questions and participation. And thank you so much to all of our presenters.
Great, thank you. Bye, everyone.
And this will be recorded and put on our website pretty shortly. So if you want to just do it all again or share it with friends, it'll be there. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.